What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamoda and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, brother? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
I can't really complain. We have officially wrapped up our series on, I guess, the rise of the Japanese Empire or the rise of Japanese nationalism, which really took
Japan.
Yeah, the creator of the modern nation state of Japan. And man, it was harder than I thought it was going to do that. I don't know
Seriously.
what your input is.
No, 100%. And I feel like we could have kept going too, but I think we got the point across of like, where did Japan start? How did it get to where it was going? But we still don't have definitive answers on like, what does it mean to be a nation state?
Even though we didn't really get answers, I mean, it was still worthwhile going through the exercise of doing an episode like that or doing a series like that, because obviously there's so many rabbit holes that you could really go down to. And it's, the goal of that series was to identify, different national trends that ultimately created or led to the rise of fanatic nationalism in the 1920s and 30s prior to World War II. And, I feel like we did it. I don't want to give us too much credit and say did a good job, because I know we went off a lot of different rabbit holes, but we've got praise on it and we've also got criticism for it, probably deservedly on both fronts. I'm sure there's different things we could have done better on it. 100%. But then again, it was worthwhile going through that exercise of like doing a series like that, because we've never done a series.
Not on purpose, at least. Yeah.
On purpose, at least. But I guess we're going to use that experience to do other countries. That was the whole plan all along, was to, practice. I don't want to say practice using Japan, but kind of use the Japan as like a jumping off point. And, we set our sights next to do one on Russia or Eastern European countries in general. That was kind of like the next jumping stone on that.
And we also wanted to take a break for a moment, because we definitely did get exhausted from doing all the research on Japan. And we were like, hey, let's just do like a modern, geopolitics episode, just go back to our roots and like talk about something that's going on in the news right now. And that was totally our intention. And then the news happened, and it basically lined right up with, our idea to move on to Russia and just Eastern European countries, generally speaking. So I think that's it's like there was a sign out there.
Yeah, we wanted to take a week break and kind of figure out like how we wanted to tackle the next steps. But then Vladimir Putin comes and he starts to invade Europe, aka New the Hitler. No, obviously, things have escalated. I'm being facetious and silly. Things have, I guess, been slowly escalating since Biden has. Well, let me pull this back a little bit, because I just want to talk about like the general division between conservatives and liberals in the United States and how they view foreign policy, which is kind of funny and a little bit disturbing at the same time. So on the right, you have this notion of being fed up with Middle Eastern wars, and you want to divert our resources to combat China. Ultimately, China is the great geopolitical threat. They're on the verge of invading Taiwan. We got to be ready. They are, aka genociding Muslims, like conservatives.
Which in itself is ironic.
Like conservatives, like the same people who were talking about like outright banning Muslims from entering the country are now concerned about Muslims in China. On the flip side, you have the American liberal. And the American liberal is, their great enemy is Russia. Russia controls America. Russia is pulling the strings on the Republican Party. And you have this kind of really weird fanatic obsession with Russia. Anything that bad happens in the world is all Russian. It's Russian fault. And it's funny because it's like they're the new classic Cold War warriors. So everything that ever happens bad in the world is like Vladimir Putin and his cronies trying to make these improvements on Western Europe and destroy liberalism across the world.
Right.
So you have like this weird hawkish mentality on both sides of the political aisle. And I'm just here saying, and I think you would probably agree with this, hey, we can talk to both of them. You know, like we don't have to go to war or have to live under the looming threat of nuclear war, because a war with either one of those countries, a war with Russia or a war with China, would mean the end of human civilization.
And we don't even have to go to the end of human civilization either. It's just not a great idea, both economically and, geopolitically, for us to be adversarial with such large superpowers. Like they're not quite, the United States. And like, let's be real, if we did a comparison, we'd probably crush them. But the point is that we don't have to get to that point either. Like all the steps that lead up to that are a problem too. Like sanctions as an example, and how sanctions hurt just normal, regular people here in the United States rather than their intended consequence, which is to, wave the finger at, places like Russia and China, which coincidentally, we do use sanctions on both of those countries as a tool to, tell them to stop fucking around. So I
punish is a tool to punish ultimately the civilian population.
Right. Of both countries.
of both countries. And, sanctions are just kind of like the first step between things get really escalated. That's what a lot of history shows us. Like sanctions, you start with sanctions and then you move on to war eventually. I love the statement, when trade stops between a country, that's when militaries start crossing borders. Or I'm paraphrasing it, but when trade stops going through borders, and that's when militaries start going through borders. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think that the Biden administration is playing a risky game right now with Russia right now, kind of poking at the bear. And it's not that Russia is a power that is equivalent to the United States. No, it's not. Let's just be frank. And in a conventional war, the United States would most likely win in a conventional war. However, the problem isn't a conventional war. The problem is that Russia has nuclear arms pointed at us at all times.
They've got more.
You bet your ass if things got out of hand, or if they've just reached the limit, we're talking about the end of a major city in New York. A major city in the United States being decimated. Yeah, we may take Moscow down with it, but I mean, is taking down Moscow worth losing New York City
or San Francisco
or San Francisco? Maybe San Francisco. I don't live there. Feel free to shoot down Californian cities. No, we have a lot of listeners from California, so I'm going to take away like 25% of our listener base. No, however, I don't think it's worth it. Now, the current situation with Biden declaring a state of emergency due to some Russian hacks and due to their Russia amassing troops on the border between Russia and Ukraine. I'll be completely honest, I don't really know too much about the hacking and cyberspace stuff. However, I do know a little bit more about the situation in Crimea and the situation in Donbass. And I think it's worth going through kind of like a crash course of how the Russia-Ukraine conflict or the Ukraine-Russia conflict became violent, because I think most mainstream news outlets, they are always starting this story at the year 2014. They usually start this story with the annexation of Crimea. Right. And after that, there's no history before that. And there's no good guy in this. Like, no. Whenever you offer kind of something that's an opinion that's outside the mainstream, you're always quickly called, like, at least in the West, a Russian asset or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think both sides are bad. They're all bad governments. But the number one thing that the corporate media fails to report is that Ukraine is really not one nation. It's two nations. So Western Ukraine,
technically it's one nation, let's be real. But
it's one nation, but it's a multi-nation country like Canada,
Right.
Canada has their French-speaking province and then their English-speaking provinces. So there's two cultures that are within Canada. Well, the same thing applies to Ukraine. So the mostly Ukraine-speaking part is located in Western Ukraine, and then the Russian-speaking population is in Eastern Ukraine. And the reason for that is just a very sad history of just like forced migrations and genocides. And the end of the Cold War, it brought on a lot of new complex problems for both Russia and the Ukraine. The main problem being that the present borders of Ukraine don't really represent any type of real nation. It's like kind of like an African state.
Right.
That
was
created by European
Middle Eastern states too,
or a Middle Eastern state. But instead of the boundaries being drawn up by European colonists, they were drawn up by Lenin and Stalin.
Yeah.
And what they would do is that they would export Russian speakers to other Soviet republics in order to quash any type of national sentiment. And because of this, after the fall of the Soviet Union, it was popular opinion in Russia that Ukraine was indeed part of Russia. So Ukrainian independence in the 1990s wasn't really a popular idea. Vladimir Putin himself is a believer in the Triune people thesis. And what this thesis argues is that Eastern Slavs are one overarching community.
Mm-hmm.
They're all descendants of the original people of Rus, a culture that was centered in Kiev 1,000 years ago. So in this view, the modern division of Eastern Slavs into things like Belarusians and Ukrainians and Russians reflects only regional and linguistic variants of a common ancestry, but these aren't distinct and separate nationalities. And this is something that's common among Russian nationalists. Even Alexei Navalny believes in this stuff. Alexei Navalny is Putin's big
opposition leader, right?
The opposition leader who I guess allegedly he tried to kill. But
I think they've confirmed that that he was poisoned.
Well, they definitely confirmed that he was poisoned. I don't want to get too into that, but
that's a different conversation. And I think we had an episode about it, so you can check that out.
Yeah, we did.
Well, look, all right. So let me just get this straight, and hopefully, I don't want to take an adversarial position against what it is that you're saying, but I do want to figure out like what's going on here, because it does sound a little bit like doublespeech to me, and I'm just kind of formulating this idea in my head like today as we were doing the research, and you're telling me, earlier, in the show, you mentioned that there's a case to be made about two Ukraines, right? We got the Eastern and the Western ones, right? Like you said, and the primary distinguishment between the two is like a linguistic and maybe a slight cultural differences. Did I get that right?
Yeah. They ultimately believe they have the same ethnic origin, because Rus was actually centered where they consider the birth of that civilization of the Eastern Slavs. Before their capital, their heritage, it all stems from Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine.
Right.
And they eventually, there was part of a Russo alliance that considered back whenever the hell. But that's where the princes of Moscow come from that eventually formed Russia. But they consider them all the same connected peoples rather than
same
different
people,
ethnic groups. Yeah.
Gotcha. All the same people. But now you just tell me about the triune people idea, right? This triune people thesis that Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians are all kind of the same people.
Yeah.
And Putin is a proponent of this. So doesn't the triune people argument kind of hurt, this stated stance of Putin and Russia of, quote, defending the Russian people that are in these Ukrainian areas? So primarily Crimea, like would be a good example, but now currently Donbass. So I guess what I'm trying to think out loud about is like, if they're all the same Triune people, where does this strong delineation of like, these people are Russians in Ukraine, where is that coming from if they're all technically the same people? Because according to this Triune thing, Russia's defending the Triune people in Ukraine from the Triune people, basically defending people from themselves.
Well, I'm not agreeing with that thesis. I'm just saying that's what they believe.
Neither am I. I'm just trying to figure out, like, what the hell's going on here? You know, like, doesn't it sound like a little bit of doublespeak? Because like, I'm not so super certain that this holds water.
Well,
you know, because
any kind of debate over ethnicity and nationality is always very murky, and you know, when you're tracing back lineage 1,000 years ago, it's very difficult to do, to like trace the actual ethnic origin of a country, as we have been trying to say within our last series in Japan. Like, it's very difficult to go back, or with China as well, like with, you know, going back to the Han people, both those episodes where we do more of like the ethnic origins. I think it's kind of pointless to try to trace your heritage back to some super or mega culture. I don't agree with those sentiments, and they're often used by modern day politicians to justify some type of action that they're doing. So,
and that's what I'm trying to attribute here to, like, you know,
so
the
doesn't
conflict
it contradict?
that's going on. Is it contradictory, right? And I guess right now where I'm at, and honestly, my mind might change after this episode, but you know, where I'm at right now is that, you know, I agree that borders are definitely bullshit, like all over the world, but especially in places like these. But geopolitical interests are actually very real, and this doesn't strike me at all as like this conflict doesn't strike me as a defense of the people, you know, the Russians that are in Donbass or the Russians that are in Crimea, but rather a defense of a geopolitical interest.
Yeah.
You know, so Donbass is actually dominated by heavy industry, things like coal mining and metallurgy. So the region Donbass takes its name from the abbreviation of the term Donetsk Coal Basin, Donbass. Right? So, and Donbass actually represents one of the largest coal reserves in Ukraine, having something like 60 billion tons of coal in reserve. So it's a, you know, it's of geopolitical interest because of the natural resources there. I don't think you can ignore that.
Oh, absolutely. This is all geopolitical interest. It's all like, you know, drawing lines in the sand. But yeah, I mean, they're using it as a pretext. I don't really think that governments care that much about like the outside populations. It's all just, you know, resources and it's like, how Machiavellian in its nature. So
exactly, how can I use this for my advantage? Right.
So contradictions in, you know, this type of logic, you know, I think that you're just going to come across them when they're used for some type of Machiavellian reason. Like, they're only using these types of logics, you know, this logic of like, oh, like, we're all one people, we need to unite, when it's politically convenient, you know. When that's not convenient, then it's like, oh, well, you know, there's a separation. There was a linguistic separation at one point in history that kind of, you know, we're still kind of the same, but there was some kind of culture. But now the West is taking advantage of that.
Exactly.
But
I mean, look, from my reading at this point, though, I see this like idea of this like liberation of Donbass as more of a way to gain that geopolitical influence over those strategic resources. Kind of like how Crimea's annexation was probably more of a way to gain access to the Black Sea than it was about Russian people in that region. But I guess maybe we just jump right into.
Let's put a pin in Crimea. Let's put a pin in Crimea, because I do want to talk about that.
For sure, yeah.
I think another problem that we need to address, that was created after the Cold War, was that there is no more agreed security architecture for Russia to replace the Warsaw Pact.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Therefore, from the moment the Soviet Union collapses in August of 1991, Russia sought to be the dominant influence over Ukraine's national security and economic policies, just like you said. Right. And the western part of Ukraine resisted them from the get-go. In the early 90s, Russia and Kiev argued over issues like the status of the Black Sea Fleet But also a really big point of contention was the disposition of nukes located within Ukrainian territory.
Of course,
because
yeah.
the U.S. and Russia at that time, like in the 90s, the U.S. and Russia had at least a political leadership had a much better relationship, like with Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton. They were jointly pressuring Ukraine to give up their nukes. And when Ukraine signed the trilateral agreement surrendering their nuclear weapons, what it did is that it kind of screwed Russia over in the future because it removed the primary obstacle between Ukraine creating a relationship with the United States.
I didn't actually know that Ukraine had nukes until before today. That's interesting.
Yeah, they had nukes, but they gave them up.
You mentioned Sevastopol and Crimea, so maybe you can tell me a little bit about when Russia and Ukraine did that deal to keep Russia's Navy base in Crimea. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So after Leonid Kuchma was elected president of Ukraine in 1994, he was actually from Eastern Ukraine, and he was born. His base was pro-Russian, and he was still a defender of Ukraine's sovereignty, but also supported trade with Russia, which diffused the separatist sentiment that was in Crimea, because there had always been a separatist movement in Crimea. The biggest admission from the corporate press about Crimea is that it is in fact very Russian. It's always like when Yanukovych was ultimately forcibly removed from office. Like if you just listen to like the interviews of people on the street in Crimea, it's all like these people are terrorists. We need to become part of Russia. They voted to become Russian. Crimea has been part of Russia since the time of Catherine the Great in the 18th century.
Right.
It was only transferred from Russia to the Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954, who was from Ukraine, and his intention of transferring it was to just pander to his Ukrainian support. And at the time, when this transfer took place, it didn't really matter because everything was ran out of Moscow anyway.
Right.
So who gives a shit? Yeah, who gives a shit if Crimea is Ukrainian? It's all it's still the Ukrainian. It's still a Soviet state, so it doesn't matter that they have. It doesn't matter.
It's kind of like arguing over. It's kind of like arguing over who owns the Statue of Liberty. Is it New York or New Jersey? Well, technically, it's in New Jersey's waters, but it's New York City's. And who the fuck cares who owns the Statue of Liberty? Because it's all the United States anyway. I mean, it cares to some New Jerseyans like me, but but this same idea, right?
Yeah, it's the same concept. Like, who cares what province or whatever it's in,
where the border is drawn, right?
It's not that big of a deal. Maybe it was a big deal for the people who lived there. As far as I don't know. I'm not an expert in how the Soviet Union went about giving funds to these different areas, but nevertheless, I mean that was probably the motivation, because I'm sure there was some level of additional funding that went into Crimea or Ukraine because they had the Crimea in it. But
there's always a reason.
Yeah, there's always a reason. But when the Soviet Union evaporates, the people who live in Crimea wanted to be part of Russia. And to put a Band-Aid over this issue, they make a deal in 1997 in which Russia recognizes Ukraine's borders, and in return, Ukraine agreed to lease Russia the naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea.
Okay, so they set up a deal to just lease out the land, and that's what Russia really wanted anyway, right? Just access to the Black Sea, right?
Yeah, and that naval base is huge. So Russia has always had a challenge of getting a warm water port. So losing that port would be really, really bad for them. It would it would be devastating to them if they've lost they lost that Navy base.
All right, so now we're basically in the mid 90s, and you're telling me Russia works out this deal with Ukraine where they're like, all right, you can keep Crimea, but we get to lease some land for this warm water port. And at the same time, the U.S. and Russia had both been pressuring Ukraine to, like you said, get rid of their nukes, and like they're changing things. So at this point, Russia and the U.S. were kind of like on good terms with each other. Would you agree with that at this moment?
I mean, the political leadership were on good terms, but I wouldn't say. So this is a whole real kind of sad history as well. I mean, there's just a lot of sad histories in Eastern Europe and this part of the world. But after the Soviet Union fell, it wasn't like a happy ending. Russia went into a period of absolute poverty when the Soviet Union fell. And listen, man, I'm no proponent of communism or anything or the economic system of the Soviet Union. Like, obviously, it imploded at the end, but there were really terrible consequences for the people who lived in Russia at that time. And the level of corruption that took place in the Russian government and Ukraine, for that matter, is at a level that is incomprehensible. Like the level of how just cronies of Boris Yeltsin just were purchasing up state-run industries. The government was basically controlled by the mob. And I think a lot of Russians saw this corruption as a product of liberalism, as like in U.S. international liberalism. Like the U.S. Russians were looking for guidance at the end of the Soviet Union. They welcomed the introduction of capitalism and the introduction of free markets, and they were looking at the United States as an example of this. And what they got was the worst part of crony capitalism. Like, that's what they got. And it's estimated that, I think the estimate's around like 3 million people died in Russia due to starvation. Like during that transition period between Russia's, Russia going from a communist country or part of this, the main country of the Soviet Union to a capitalist country, which still really isn't a capitalist country. But I think that there became this mistrust of international liberalism within the Russian populace, because they just saw how much they were getting ripped off. Like, we're talking about people coming in and just, a handful of oligarchs buying all the Soviet state-run assets. So
buying everything. Yeah.
Buying industries, like not buying companies, buying industries in these like crony scam.
What was the word for it?
Kangaroo auctions.
Auctions, yeah, the kangaroo auction.
These kangaroo auctions where I always recommend this book, and we've talked about this in other episodes. Godfather of the Kremlin is a really good book that goes over the politics of Russia in the 1990s. And I think that was a huge damper on just the perception of the West in Russia. That's why Russians have told me, actually, why Putin is so popular in Russia, because Putin threw a lot of those Russian oligarchs in jail and exiled Boris Berezovsky, who was one of the worst offenders. So I think that's where you get that division.
You're painting this picture, right? Like, this is how it starts to deteriorate. Like, how, other than just the abject poverty that came out of, out of the late 90s in Russia, like, what else started pulling the U.S. and Russia, or the West in general, apart from one another? So
on a more geopolitical front, the war in Yugoslavia had a deeply coercive impact on Russia's relations with the West, because Clinton committed himself to supporting NATO enlargement in 1994, and the war in Yugoslavia helped ensure that Europe was still going to have security problems despite the end of the Cold War. What this also did was that it undermined the notion that Russia could be a reliable partner in solving problems in Eastern Europe. And this is a topic for another day, so I don't want to dive too deep into it. But during the war in Kosovo, Russia and U.S. were really close to going to war. Like, they were very, very close to going to war. The only reason they didn't is because a British general, a field marshal named Michael Jackson, Michael Jackson, he refused to follow General Wesley Clark's orders to engage with the Russians on the battle because
General, I don't want to go to war with the Russians.
But he was like, I'm not starting World War III for you. But
you're ignorant. I don't want to start World War III.
But I think the issue of NATO enlargement is the most hostile thing surrounding this conflict. And this could be the issue that ultimately, I mean, if there is a war, the issue of NATO enlargement would be the catalyst.
Sure. Just
to give you some background, and this goes into your question about, what else made relations between the U.S. and Russia deteriorate. After the Berlin Wall goes down, George H.W. Bush promises Mikhail Gorbachev at the Malta summit that the U.S. is not going to take advantage of their crumbling empire. Well, a few months later, there's an immediate obstacle thrown in there. Something I know you know a lot about is East and West Germany start the process of reunification.
Oh, yeah. That was a complicated one.
Well, what makes things complicated is that West Germany is a member of NATO. So if they reunify, what happens? Does the whole country be part of NATO? How the hell did you figure that out?
That was the big question of the day. Also, the fall of the wall is super interesting, too. I hope we have an opportunity to talk about that in this series because it kind of happened by accident. But, yeah. That was a big question. What happens NATO-wise to Germany now that they're reunified?
So the Secretary of State, James Baker, he negotiates a deal with the Soviets that lets East Germany reunite with West Germany, and then it lets them be part of NATO. So they agree, you guys reunify, you guys can be part of NATO. In return, though, the U.S. promises not to enlarge NATO, not one more inch to the east. Mm-hmm. So this is the ultimate schism. This is what is ultimately leading to the tensions between. I mean, there's other things, but I think this is the ultimate difference of opinion between Russia and the West, because the Clinton administration reneges on that deal. And this wasn't a signed deal. Here's the problem: they never got to some paper.
It was a handshake.
This wasn't a signed treaty. This was verbally communicated from George H.W. Bush's administration to Boris Yeltsin. So it never was something that was like a treaty that the United States will not, go and actively invite other countries closer to Russia's borders into NATO. There was never a treaty that specifically, laid that out. Even if there were, as we see in modern politics today, former presidents or presidential administrations, at least now, feel no obligation to honor any type of treaty that previous administrations have honored. You can see that with Trump and the Iran deal, for example.
Mm-hmm. That's a big example.
There's no incentive. They don't give a fuck. So even if it was in writing, it probably wouldn't have mattered.
Especially if it was in writing, they're like, doesn't apply to me.
Doesn't apply to me. This is a new administration. There's a national security threat. There's a national security threat.
Yeah, that's troubling because then it really kind of destabilizes the word of the United States. Whatever happened to word is bond. That's not a thing anymore.
Well, you can use the word national security threat and basically get away with anything. You're like, oh my God, there's an army of puppies. We need to kill them all. They're a national security threat. You can use national security threat as a pretext to do anything that you want in U.S. politics. Just think about all the shit that we were able to pull off after 9/11, as far as surveillance and just invasion of privacy. And
how we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years.
No, not even that, but just through with the domestic population.
You're talking about internally. Yeah,
internally, you can do whatever you want. Just fill out a fucking form to sign up for a credit card processor, and look at the questions that are asked that are due to the Patriot Act. Like they're
Are
totally
you involved
invasive.
with a terrorist organization?
Yeah, like just
It's
go
like,
sign up.
no,
Anyone who's
and
a
why
small
would I
business,
ever say yes?
any small business owner will probably know that when you sign up for credit card processing, the shit they ask you in like enough form.
It happened to us when we put together our business. You know, it's like they asked us the same questions. It's kind of hilarious. It's like, why would we ever say, oh, you got me? I'm a part of a terrorist organization. Why would you? Like, it's just kind of silly, honestly.
But that's just one example. So back to NATO expansion.
Okay.
Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, they're invited into NATO in 1999. And then NATO expands again in 2004 to Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. So
Hold on to that point real quick, though. But this is something that I actively do want to research over the course of this bit, and I feel like it'll be very important about like the invitation or the expansion process of NATO. Because I'm actually super curious about this, you know, to see, is it truly that the Clinton administration, or at least the powers that be in NATO, are actively recruiting people, or is it that these countries request access to these countries? Or and I imagine that the answer is probably extremely nuanced, and like what powers play into, you know, how these new countries get added to NATO, because it doesn't, you know, obviously Poland, as an example, didn't join NATO by force, right? Like, we didn't force them to join NATO. They joined free willingly.
they want to be part of NATO. You know, like
right. But also we're trying to expand it.
They're also
you know
trying
what I mean?
It's both. It's both.
I just want to know more about that.
It takes, I think ultimately a lot of what happens is that, so Russia will be like, expansion of NATO is a threat to us. Mm-hmm. We must amass troops and train troops, and then therefore it then creates the perception of a threat from these countries like Bulgaria or Estonia, and they're like, oh no, Russia's amassing troops, we need to join NATO. It ultimately it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of Russia, but also I think it's just to box them in. Like, from the Western perspective, or the U.S.'s perspective, it is really to box them in as far as possible, like to limit their options as much as possible, because they don't want them. They're trying to limit their influence within these states, because Russia is one of the few countries in the world that makes decisions independent from U.S. influence. Like, they will do things outside of the allowable foreign policy positions that the U.S. has, like intervening in Syria is probably the greatest example.
Totally.
The United States obviously did not support the government of Bashar al-Assad. The Russians did.
So I can make similar arguments here for both of these things. Like, in the way that Russia got involved with Syria, like Syria didn't, they weren't invaded by Russia. Like, Syria invited them. So this is a deal that was, put together between Russia and Syria. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, that's none of their business. That's none of the U.S.'s business.
It is their business because they want to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. That's where it becomes their business. Right.
But like, literally though, if we're talking about two to tango, right? Like, really, this is just this is Syria as a country. They're a sovereign nation. They said, yeah, sure, Russia, come help us do some stuff. Much in the same way, because I can flip this on the other side here, in the same way that it's none of Russia's business if Slovakia wants to be a part of NATO. That's none of their business. This isn't the Soviet Union anymore. They can join if they want to. And they should have been thoughtful about this and try to find ways to exercise their influence in places like Slovakia and Slovenia, etc., in ways that would dissuade them from wanting to join NATO. And it seems like the response that they've always had throughout this history has always just been like, let's just put mad troops on the border. Like, let's flex our dick muscle and see if that works. And it doesn't always work.
Well, it's certainly
recently, but at least then it didn't work.
Oh, sorry. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, I think, a lot of times. But in terms of like going against Russian, just to go back on what you said about like it's none of the United States' business whether when Syria invited Russia in. that's not how they think. Like the people making our foreign policy don't think like that. Like, oh, well, I guess it's none of our business. Like they identified a policy of removing Bashar al-Assad as a president of Syria. Anyone who gets in their way is a geopolitical obstacle, and we must find a way to neutralize them. So they don't care about those types of boundaries that countries have. But in 2008, Russia finally puts their foot down, and there are rumors that NATO will be providing membership to the Ukraine. So this is where Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warns the U.S. Niet means niet. I think a lot of people have heard that. An invitation to either Ukraine or Georgia will trigger some type of Russian reaction, because at that point, then they're just completely boxed in. If Ukraine or Russia or Ukraine or Georgia are part of NATO. But before the conversation started up about bringing the Ukraine into NATO, the West was the West was keeping Leonid Kukma at arm's length because he was transparently very, very corrupt. Like there's all sorts of really bad scandals tied to him, including things like murdering journalists, which caused Kukma to seek tighter relations with Vladimir Putin in Russia. This starts to transition in like 2004 when during the 2004 Ukrainian presidential election, Russia saw their opportunity to finally get their guy in Kiev, and they supported
Yanukovych.
Yanukovych was the guy that was ultimately ousted during the coup later in 2014, but he ran for president in 2004 and initially won, but the election was recalled due to voter fraud, and Yushchenko won the election in the recall. But the
Yushchenko's the comedian guy, right?
No, that's Zelensky. Oh, that's the guy right now.
I get them all confused.
I mean, they're all similar sounding names. So the agreement to rerun the election turned a Russian victory into a Russian defeat on the world stage. And what this episode ultimately does, it merges Ukrainian-Russian relations into Russia's relations with the West. So I guess this is kind of like a long-formed answer of how U.S. relations and Russian relations eventually deteriorated. It was a combination of all these things: the war in Yugoslavia, NATO expansion, and ultimately the recalled election in 2004 in Ukraine. Now, the Orange Revolution that takes place afterwards promised domestic reform and integration with Europe, but neither really occurred. Just intense corruption continued. And going back to the Ukraine's entrance into NATO, or at least the rumors of that, in 2008, the U.S. supported giving Ukraine a membership action plan to join NATO,
and that's the steps that they give you to you have to do these things in order to be admitted into NATO, right?
Yeah. And this is when Russia said "niet" means "niet," like no fucking way. And Germany and France, who are dependent on Russian gas, they blocked that proposal. They were like, "This is fucking nuts. We can't do this. Like, this is gonna. Do you know how this is gonna impact us economically?"
Right.
So,
and Germany and France are both in NATO.
Yeah.
Which makes it even more of a clusterfuck because, as you said, if they're dependent on Russian gas, they don't want to piss off Russia because then they get hurt economically. On the other side, the United States is pushing for the idea of this membership action plan for Ukraine, which is kind of like, on the one hand, sticking it to Russia, but also shooting itself, NATO, in the foot. In Germany and France, it's kind of complicated Mexican standoff there.
But let's go back to Yanukovych. He enters the political scene back in 2010, and he's like a pragmatic politician. He's seen as a viable answer, and he wins the 2010 election. And this election is actually legitimate. Like, if you look at the election results of 2010, it's split. Like, it's totally split by region of the country. Like, the entire eastern part of the country is voting for Yanukovych, and then the entire western part of the country is voting for I can't think of her name, the lady,
The other one.
the woman who was running, who was super corrupt and skeevy. All of them are really corrupt and skeevy. But upon his election, he immediately starts taking dramatic steps to consolidate political power and sell resources and ultimately gain the support of Russia. Like, he's still Russia's guy, even though the elections were legitimate. Mm-hmm. And there were voting the voter observation groups that were monitoring the election, and there was no red flags. What added fuel to the fire here is that Ukraine in 2008, 2009, they were really hit hard by the global financial crisis.
Right.
And they were in a position where they had to choose who was going to bail them out. And the question became, was it going to be the EU who was going to bail them out, or was it going to be Russia who was going to bail them out? And by late 2013, Ukraine, Russia, and the West had gotten themselves into a contest in which a compromise really couldn't be figured out. And Ukrainians were forced to make a binary choice between dependency on the EU or being a dependency on Russia. Mm-hmm. Most Ukrainians supported close economic ties with both Russia and the European Union.
Like at the same time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like, which would be the
that's the smart idea.
The ideal thing. It's like, okay, let's all have trading relationships and not be antagonistic with each other. Mm-hmm. But this process was made impossible, and it wasn't made feasible either, because not being a member of either bloc would just create isolation and further undermine Ukraine's economy. So
it's the kind of you're either with us or against us mentality that's like, that's going on here.
Exactly. So when he announces that Ukraine was not going to sign the association agreement with the EU, this sparked this massive violent protesting that was allegedly funded by the United States and other EU countries, which was directed by Victoria Nuland, who's now in the Biden administration. And in 2014, Yanukovych was voted out of office by Parliament. He was exiled into Russia, and Crimea, a Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, says, fuck that. They vote to leave Ukraine, and it becomes part of Russia. Mm-hmm. And the Russian military was already there. It wasn't like Russia invaded it. They already had a military base there. So they're just, they threw up their Russian flags, and they're like, okay, we have the parliament, that we have all the government administration buildings. This is now Russia. They gladly welcomed the annexation. But in response, this is where the conflict really begins. The government in Kiev launches pretty much a domestic war on terror on the eastern pro-Russian part of the country, because Russia now is supporting Russian separatists in the eastern part who don't want to be part of the government in Kiev.
Specifically in the Donbass region.
Specifically in the Donbass region. And the war has gotten very violent. And one of the issues is that at this time, at least 2014, Ukraine doesn't really have a military. They don't. At the end of the Soviet Union, one of the big differences between Ukraine and Russia, because Ukraine's a big country. Ukraine has
it's like bigger than most of the European countries. Just the Donbass region itself is comparably sized to like Moldova, to like Slovenia, Czechia. Like, there's a lot of countries that are quite smaller than just the region that we're talking about for this particular conflict, let alone all of Ukraine. Ukraine's fucking big.
It has 50 million people. there living in Ukraine, which is among the highest in Europe. Russia has the largest population with around 150 million people. Germany has
80 million last
80
time I
million
checked,
people.
yeah.
France has something around 70 to 80 million people. Ukraine is up there population wise. The question is why does they both have assets from the Soviet Union? They both inherited parts of the Soviet Union's military. Why did Russia, or let me rephrase this, it's not really a matter of why, it's what they did, is Russia maintain a policy of fostering and adding and
Advancing their military.
Advancing their military, and Ukraine kind of disbanded it during those periods.
I got to give it to Russia because they do much more with so much less. Their military budget, as an example, pales in comparison to ours. But they make some technology, and they make some specifically their jets and their surface-to-air missile systems are incredibly good. And their tanks are incredibly good, and just the sheer volume and number that they have, they lack in a lot of other places too. But what they do with such little resources, they're really, really crafty. Let's just put it that way. And you're right. I don't think that these other former Soviet states really had the desire or the drive, or maybe just didn't even have the economics really to invest in the same ways that Russia did. Into their military to maintain dominance, because realistically, the size and positioning of Ukraine, they could be a powerful state in that region. They could be a very powerful military state. They
could, but I guess the division within the country. Yep. I mean, there's so many things going against it at the same time between the division, the ethnic division in the country that is fostered by Russia and fostered by the West.
Right.
They're kind of just being torn apart from outside powers, and
right.
The whole history is just very sad.
Well, no, go ahead. Keep going.
Just one more thing to add. Mm-hmm. Since they don't have a real military, they relied in 2014. They were relying on paramilitary groups that they would integrate into their National Guard. And the type of groups that they were integrating, a lot of them were
moderate
neo-fascist groups. They were neo-fascist type groups that were hardcore fucking Hitler-loving Nazis.
They were Nazis.
That's who they were forced to kind of
integrate. They were
Nazis into their armed forces. And since the war started, the official estimate of the death tolls in tens of thousands, but some people think it's a lot higher. And there's been pretty bad atrocities that have taken place, like the fire in Odessa that they burnt. It basically was like Waco and Ukraine's Waco. There's been a lot of atrocities, and it's pretty bad. And
look, I honestly, I think it is terrible, but it's also, I feel like what we should do is we should look at the conflict, the 5-day war with Georgia, between Russia and Georgia, as almost like as a template for the conflict with Ukraine, because there are so many parallels between the two. And I think looking at that might give a little bit of context to what's going on right now. So I think looking at the two, I don't want to say that it is predictive, but so far it seems like a lot of the same things have occurred that led up to the 5-day war against Georgia with Russia that are happening currently in Ukraine. So let's talk a little bit about that. So the basic root of this Russia-Georgia conflict, you could probably bring it really far back, but I think the real start is in that early 90s period when the USSR broke apart, and Russia and Georgia both were, they became their own independent nations. And what was happening in Georgia, which I imagine was also happening in a lot of other, former Eastern European or Soviet bloc states, was that there was a civil war happening, right? There's a lot of like self-identifying and like, who are we as a nation? And a lot of people were trying to turn to, super old, like pre-Soviet Union nationalism. And so this caused a lot of tension in Georgia. And Georgia happens to be located in the just south of Russia there, right along the sea, along the Black Sea. And there was these two particular provinces or states in Georgia that were particularly a problem for Georgia. It was South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So South Ossetia is just like just under the mountain line between Georgia and Russia, and Abkhazia is in the northwestern coast on the Black Sea. And both of these regions wanted to declare their own independence, right? They didn't want to be a part of Georgia, and they didn't want to be a part of Russia. They just wanted to be their own thing. Part of this was like talking about like 20th century, autonomy that they had. But there was a ceasefire in 94 for these civil wars, but there was still a lot of tension that was happening in these two particular provinces. And the tensions were because of ethnic divides, right? So the Ossetians and the Abkhazians, were ethnically different from the rest of Georgia and from Russia. And like I said before, they used to, prior to I should say after the Russian Revolution, they had this kind of autonomy, and they were their own thing for a little bit, and they wanted to get that back. But the EU and NATO, like you were saying, Henry, they were expanding their influence in Eastern and Central Europe, and Russia, and specifically Putin, obviously hated this because it removed that buffer zone, for the West. And so Georgia was actually, at this point, the state of Georgia was becoming more westernized, right? They were joining the sphere of influence of the West and the U.S., and so much so that they actually joined the U.S. coalition forces fighting in Iraq in 2003.
Wait, let me just put a pin on that, because that was another big contention in U.S. and Russian divergence. Because Russia was supportive of the U.S.'s initial war on terror after 9/11, because Russia has their own terror problem.
Right.
Russia has their terror problem in Chechnya, so they saw that as like a coalition, like,
similar,
we can fight Islamist. We have our own Islamist problem down in Chechnya. You have your Islamist problem due to your imperial escapades in the Middle East. But they did not support the war in Iraq. They were one of the only big countries who was like, nope, we don't want any part of that. This is going to really fuck things up. And they were right. They were 100% right about their predictions.
And so when we see a state like Georgia, right, joining the U.S. in this war of terror in Iraq, that kind of started creating the sphere of influence that the U.S. had, or that NATO broadly would have in Georgia. And this got really intense the year later when a pro-Western president was elected. This was Mikhail Saakashvili, and that was in 2004. So we got Saakashvili. He's elected. He's pro-Western, and they're also at war with the U.S. in Iraq. So they're becoming very Western. And
George Bush is like, oh, they're so great. They're crowning of democracy. Oh,
exactly. So at this point, Georgia's trying to break away from the Russian influence, and Russia is trying to hang on to it, right? And this is especially threatening to Russia because if it lost Georgia, this could be a domino effect that could ripple outwards for them losing influence over other formerly Soviet territories, like Ukraine, as an example. And so Saakashvili started to crack down on the separatism, the separatist notions inside of Georgia, specifically in those two provinces in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And this kind of sparked these conflicts again, even though the Civil War had been over officially. It started bringing up some of this separatist ideas. And then also Putin was accused of basically egging on separatism in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which I'm sure he was a part of it for sure, because that was of geopolitical interest to him and to Russia. So Georgia ends up arresting 4 Russian military officers for allegedly spying. And Russia responded by closing a bunch of Georgian businesses and deporting Georgian citizens from Russia. So this is becoming a problem. So Georgia was basically running towards NATO at full speed at this juncture. And Russia sees this as an opportunity to basically put the kibosh on the whole idea by flexing its dick muscle. And so Russia is said to have officially recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as a part of Georgia. So they're saying, yes, sure, you are technically a part of Georgia. We're good with that. But at the same time, it's starting to put in its little tendrils into those regions. And basically, it started setting up these Russian economic and political dependencies. Kind of like how Germany and France are dependent on Russia for gas, right? So they start making a lot of these political and economic dependencies in those regions on purpose, and setting those systems up. And a lot of the people from both of those regions also started getting a shit ton of Russian citizenship, right? So a lot of these people started becoming Russian citizens. They started giving out Russian passports. This is like a policy in Russia known as passportization. And go figure, the same thing is happening in Ukraine right now. So just remember that part. In the Donbass region, a lot of that is happening. And the same thing happened in Crimea just before Russia annexed it. So a lot of Russian influence in these two regions of Georgia, but also specifically Russia started building up some forces on the border for, quote, military exercises. That's kind of happening right now. And basically, they started making sure that their local proxies in South Ossetia and in Abkhazia put up enough resistance in Georgia so that Saakashvili, the president there, would respond, right? Because remember, he doesn't want them to break off and be separatists. So on August 8th in 2008, after just straight up months of finger pointing and a series of small clashes between South Ossetian military and Georgian military troops, basically Saakashvili ordered Georgian troops to capture the South Ossetian capital. So he was like, go ahead, round it up, go get it. This is what Russia wanted, because Russia responded pretty much immediately with airstrikes on Georgian positions in South Ossetia, as well as Abkhazia. And the conflict continued for 5 days. Russia quickly took control of both of those capitals there in those regions, and rolled its tanks through Ossetia into Georgia proper. And they stopped something like 30 miles away from the Georgian capital of Tbilisi. I can't pronounce that fucking word. But they stopped only like 30 miles away, which is dangerously close. They probably could have just taken Georgia if they really wanted to. But I think the result of this, geopolitics aside, about 850 people were killed during that 5-day conflict. 35,000 something plus Georgians were left homeless because, they were basically bombing the shit out of those areas. Russia formally recognized both South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. Almost no countries in the world have joined them in doing so, but basically this pushed Georgia super far away from Russian influence. They'll probably never turn back at this point. And they recently signed, 6 years ago, they signed an association agreement with the EU, and that was in 2014.
Well, I think that was really bad policy by George Bush, because what it did is it encouraged Georgia to they thought that they had the backing of NATO during this whole thing, that they had the backing of the United States, that they were some prized ally, and they weren't. Like when push came to shove, like they let the Russians do whatever the hell they wanted. They let them bomb and act militarily. And I think that same thing is going to happen in Ukraine. Like I think that template will apply to Ukraine, where Russia is much more militarily powerful than Ukraine. If Russia wanted to, they can march over to Kiev and conquer it. I think that there could be a circumstance or a situation where Russia does something like that in the future, saying, all right, our options are over. We are going to act militarily. This is a national security threat for Ukraine to be part of NATO. We are going to set the line here. We're going to launch a full invasion into Ukraine and take Kiev, and the West will not be able to do anything except fund separatist movements and things like that, or fund Ukrainian nationalist movements. So I think that's bad outcome, but I think that provocations and assuring Ukraine's that the United States will have their back no matter what can ultimately lead to an outcome like that. So I don't.
So I'm super worried about this, because I think a lot of the lead up is already in place. So a lot of the shit that already happened in Georgia right before that 5-day war has already exactly happened. We have in Ukraine already the passportization of Russians in the Donbass region, right? We already have basically these operations orchestrated largely by Russian government to get to fuel separatists' identification in those regions. We already saw that happen, in Crimea, and it worked like a fucking charm, right? Because people voted to become Russian, right? And it was like not exactly a bloodless loss, but it was mostly, just, okay, cool, done. It's going to be a little bit different in the Donbass region, of course, because it is a bit more entrenched, to say the least. But so we've already got the passportization. We already have the amassing of troops and military exercises on the border. We already have separatist motion happening in those regions. We already have the justification in place, because they are, quote, Russian, right? And that was the thing that we were talking about a little earlier, and all we're really waiting for is for, Zelensky to fuck up and decide to just start rolling tanks into the area to repel any, any separatist uprisings. That'll be the catalyst.
And Zelensky's poll numbers are down right now, and Ukraine is always going through some economic crisis, so it could be a political move just to garner support. But
it will be a mistake.
It will be a mistake. But I think that I don't think Zelensky's retarded. Like I don't think he's dumb. I don't think he's too gung ho about getting into a full on war. But I guess we'll see. This is a dangerous situation. I think this is the most dangerous situation on Earth right now. Like, as far as like a potential wrong step could lead to the end. This right here, like if something goes wrong in this Ukrainian-Russian crisis right now, I think this is the most probable thing that will destroy the world with a nuclear holocaust. I'm not trying to spread fear. I'm just saying if you're going to pick one hotspot in the world that could lead to a full-on nuclear holocaust across the country, it's this situation right here.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't think it will. I'm just saying,
well,
if there is one, it's right here.
For sure. I'd probably agree with that. I want to end our show today because we're coming close here to our usual time. But I thought of a fun thought experiment that we can do together. And I don't know how it's going to go. And I told you about it just before the show, but I didn't give you any of the details. And you can attest to that, right, Henry?
That is true.
Okay, so you just know the topic and you don't know any of the situations. So we're going to play this one out. And the thought experiment is, so I was thinking about how Russia is using this idea that, Crimea was always Russian and therefore its annexation was justified, and is kind of playing with this idea, in the Donbass region, because it is mostly Russian speaking, majority Russian speaking, I should say. And a lot of people there identify as Russian, as a pretext or as a justification for its annexation, or at least its involvement, specifically militarily, in the region. And so my question is, well, I was thinking about Crimea, and I was thinking about how you said in 54?
Yeah.
54. 1954 is when Crimea was given to Ukraine. And around the same time, Russia gives, or, I should say not Russia, but specifically the United States signs Alaska as its, what was it, 49th state, or was it the 50th? 49th. So around the same time, we get Alaska and Ukraine gets Crimea. And I started thinking about that, like, oh, wait, because Russia used to have Alaska. Do you know the story of how Alaska became a state, Henry?
I actually really don't know too much about the history of Alaska. I know that it was purchased by Russia. I mean, it was purchased from
we
Russia.
Purchased it from Russia, basically. That's like the simple story. But I think looking at Alaska's history could be a fun way to kind of test the rationality of the Russian military conflicts in Georgia and in Crimea, and perhaps in the near future, the Donbass. The main point that I want you to take away from this is that Russia was in Alaska way before we were, and for way longer than we were.
Well, it's right. I mean, it's almost, they used to be connected.
Yep, they used to be connected.
I mean, you can technically...
Sarah Palin says it herself. You could look outside of Sarah Palin's backyard and see Moscow.
She said that?
Yeah, she said something to that effect, which is fucking stupid.
That's funny. You could, during the winter, it is possible. I looked it up. You can walk
across the Bering Strait.
Like, it's possible. You can't, you'll most likely die if you try doing it.
Yeah.
But it is possible if you move at a certain speed and the coldest part of the winter, to outrun the melting ice. But you have to travel because it's only 50 miles long.
Yeah. And I mean, that's how human beings like Homo sapiens made their way across. Yeah, Homo sapiens made their way across from that land bridge, because at one point it was totally land. Yeah,
at one point it was totally land, or it was totally frozen over. But you could still technically do it now, but you have to be an extreme athlete if you want to. If you want, they should have a contest. I don't know why isn't that an Olympic game or something, or some type of
a sport between the Russians
sport,
and the United States? Who can run across to the other side faster?
I want to know. Yeah, I'd pay to see it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about that history, right? So in 1867, the Secretary of State of the United States, William Seward, and a Russian envoy, Baron Edward de Stokel, they signed a treaty of cession, where the Russian Empire basically ceded Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, which is $113 million in today's money. So fucking bargain, right? And this ended Russia's...
And look at it now. We pay people to live in Alaska.
Yeah, and I'll get to that. That's important. I'll get to that in a second. So, but what's important about this, even before talking about that, is that this ended a 125-year stint that Russia had in Alaska and its expansion across the Bering Sea. At one point, their stint on this side of the world went as far south as Fort Ross, California, which is 90 miles from San Francisco. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
Yep. So they were all over this fucking area, right? And So today, obviously, Alaska, as you pointed out, Henry, is the richest state in the U.S., or at least one of them, and it's because they have so much natural resources like petroleum, so gas and shale and shit like that, but also gold and fish and there's a shit ton of like logging that goes on there, and it's also a strategic geopolitical location because you can see Russia, and also very recently because in the Arctic Circle, all of the glaciers and shit are melting, and it's like uncovering all of this new natural resources that everyone wants a piece of. So now that we have Alaska, we basically have a stake to the claim there. So Alaska is super important, but this goes back like super long ago, like in the 16th century, 1581 specifically. Russia basically overran a Siberian territory known as the Khanate of Sibir, which was controlled by a great-grandson of Genghis Khan. So it's pretty interesting. And by taking over this particular territory, they opened up Siberia, and within 60 years, they had expanded all the way to the Pacific. And in the early 18th century, Peter the Great, who is famous for creating Russia's first navy, he basically wanted to know, how far does this landmass go? Like, how far east did this go? So he kept pushing, and in 1741, a dude named Vitus Bering crossed the strait that is now known as the Bering Strait because of him. And he ended up in what is today a village called Yakutat, Alaska, which is near the mountain Mount St. Elias. It was an interesting story too. Like I don't want to spend too much time on it, but they basically on the way back home they ended up shipwrecking, which was crazy. And Bering actually died shortly after. But what the surviving crew fixed the ship. They stocked it full of hundreds of sea otters. This was like a big thing. Foxes and fur seals. And it was just so ridiculously abundant there. And they took it all back to Siberia, and they impressed some Russian guys. And this basically set up like a gold rush, to the area from Siberia, because it was just so rich with natural resources and like specifically furs and pelts and things like that. So at the peak of it, Russians in Alaska, there were only about 800 at its peak. And also they were fucking far away from St. Petersburg, which was the capital at the time. So communication was a super big problem. And also Alaska was just fucking really far north. It's cold in Alaska, so it was hard to do agriculture there, so they had to import a lot of food, and therefore it kind of like naturally limited the number of settlers that they can put in Alaska. So that's actually when they started going further south, and initially they just went south so that they can do trade. They were just looking for people to trade with, and they had eventually found the Spaniards there, and they were trading with the Spaniards to try to get enough supplies to hold up their Alaskan colony. But eventually they set up their own settlement. I mentioned this before, Fort Ross in 1812. And this is like, again, super close to San Francisco, which is crazy. I didn't even know this before just recently. But within like 30 years after that, Russians were like seriously questioning whether they can continue, holding up in Alaska, because it just wasn't profitable anymore. They had decimated the sea otter population. And a lot of the other natural resources were starting to dwindle. And then also it's just hard to defend Alaska, because it's so remote, and it was so far from their capital. So, and also Russia was in, a little bit of a pickle. They were short on cash because they were in a war in Crimea, no less. So that's a funny callback. So at that point they were just like, all right, we got to sell this shit. So in the 1840s, the United States had basically been on full manifest destiny mode, right? They had expanded into Oregon, they annexed Texas, they fought a war with Mexico, and they got California. And, the U.S. kind of saw Alaska as like a potential, cash cow. They're like, oh shit, we can probably get gold there. And fur and all this other stuff. And they also wanted to trade with China and Japan, go call back to, our series on both of those countries. But also, the U.S. was worried about England, setting up a territory in that area. So they were just like, all right, let's go ahead and buy this. So they came to a deal, and the deal was again $7.2 million at the time, or $113 million in our money today, which is a fucking steal. I said this before, but the U.S. got 370 million acres of land, just ridiculous amounts of hundreds of billions, incalculable amounts of money in natural resources like whale oil, fur, copper, gold, fish, timber, like on and on and on. There's just millions of things that they can harvest from Alaska, and like you said, Henry, at this point, there's no sales or income tax in Alaska, and every resident gets a stipend, so they get their freedom dividend over there, which is crazy. I wish we had that here. Today, Alaska is super important to us because of obviously all the resources, but also because it's strategic defense reasons. And now we get to the point of 1959, and we're coming to the thought experiment, I promise, Henry. In 59, Eisenhower signed the Alaska Statehood Act and made Alaska an official state. And that's only 5 years after Khrushchev transferred Crimea to Ukraine, right? So in this time, or at least by the time of secession, which was in the 1800s, there was only about 50,000 indigenous peoples in Alaska and 483 Russians, but also a somewhat big population of Creoles. So these are Russian men and indigenous women were having babies. So there's about 1,400 of those. So they outnumbered the actual Russians. And today, Alaska has a population of about almost 800,000, of which 120,000 are natives, and only 2% are of Russian descent. So what does this have to do with Russia-Ukraine conflict today? Okay, so here's the actual thought experiment. Imagine if there was more of a significant population of Russians in Alaska today. Would this be just cause for Russia to defend Russians in Alaska like they do in the Donbass region?
Well, you can make that same analogy for Brooklyn. Like, I'm sure there's more Russians in Brooklyn than there are Alaska. Or
right,
any
but
part
they don't have a
or
historical
any part of the
presence
East
in it.
Coast.
Yeah, but they don't have a historical presence in Brooklyn, right? So, like, technically,
I mean, up until like the 1910s, 20s. I mean, they start coming in. I mean.
Yeah, but as immigrants, right? We're talking about, like, technically Russian presence was in Alaska longer than Alaska has been a state in the United States. Alaska has been a state in the U.S., by itself, the fact that Alaska is a state doesn't make geographic sense, right? It's definitely much more Russian in terms of its proximity to the mainland than it is American. But, like, imagine for a moment, Russia's like, oh, well, Alaska's always been Russian. This dates back to the 1500s when when Bering crossed the Bering Straits, and they start making this idea. And so they start issuing Russian passports to Russian Americans or like Russian Creoles in Alaska. And then maybe they start whipping up some proxies.
But these people are American. These people.
Well, you could say the same thing about
heritage.
Ukrainians. You could say the same thing about these Ukrainians. They are Ukrainian nationals.
No,
they
but
just
they
happen
don't
to be
speak.
Russian.
No, but they're dominant Russian speakers. Like they speak Russian as a first language.
The language
like,
doesn't mean
Russian.
shit.
Like
the language doesn't mean shit. The
language
Native
is
Americans,
everything.
The Inuit people in Alaska speak Inuit languages. They speak native languages, but they're American. They're very different from other Americans, but they are American, right? So it's not the language. And the Russians would technically be able to say
national heritage. They have ceased to be Russian anymore, and they are now American citizens who are born in America. And no, Russia has no claim or pretext.
I don't know, man.
Say
I don't know.
That resources in Alaska belong to them because there are descendants of like the first colonists or the first white people in Russia, like. Mm-hmm. There's also no political will for those Russian Alaskans, who are the descendants of the first colonists, to be part of Russia. Like, they have a pretty good thing going on with not paying a federal income tax and not paying a state income tax and not paying, getting a stipend and getting all these benefits. And there's no way that Russia, even if there was like, hey, we got this plan to create a separatist movement in Alaska between the Russian colonists. There's no way that Russia could pull it off, because we're not, like, the United States is the most powerful country in the world. So
right,
you couldn't
of course,
even do it. Like, you couldn't even think about doing that. Like,
but here's the
there's
funny
political
part about
consequences for doing that.
Definitely.
Like, you
The
could fuck
funny thing
around
is-
with little Ukraine or little Georgia or other countries.
That's kind of
and
that's what I want to get to, because they wouldn't be able to pull it off against the United States because we're powerful, right? But the urge for the United States to want to push back against a separatist, like a Russian separatist, environment in Alaska, is the exact same response that the Ukrainian government has against a separatist motion in Crimea or in Donbass. They don't want that to happen, but they're just not the United States. They're not superpower. So they get bullied about
I get what the point you're trying to make is, that we wouldn't like it if they did it to us, type of thing.
Right.
However, I think that there's a lot more reception to a nationalist movement in Ukraine because, like, they identify, they're ethnically Russian. Like, they're ethnic. They're speaking the language. Their parents are, or their grandparents are, probably or could be people that were transferred there from Russia. So there's a lot more linkage.
Of course. And in the thought experiment, I also assumed that the Russian population in Alaska was much larger and much more Russian. Something more.
Okay, let's just for the sake of the thought of experiment, let's just say that there were these like Russian communities that still spoke like Vlad, like, hey, Boris.
But they just happen to be American because they're in Alaska.
Oh, now you have to live under banner of American government. Oh, hey, down North America. We want to be back with Mother Russia.
Exactly.
Oh, the Inuit, the Intuit.
Yeah, let's just say if there was that type of population, like these Russians.
Hey, Vlad. Hey, Shmuel. And that's more Jewish. Like, hey, Vlad. Like,
And they got a lot of guns up there in Alaska too, so they could seriously put up a fight if they wanted to. In this thought experiment, like, they would actually have a militia,
and they have so much frontier too to hide around, so they could just hide. There's so many mountain ranges.
Guerrilla warfare, straight up.
Well, I'm sure that would be quite the problem if they go in the Alaskan mountain range and they start doing like these guerrilla attacks on Juneau or Anchorage.
Yeah,
Anchorage is a war zone in itself. It's like the meth capital of the country.
Oh yeah. So maybe the meth would get the Russians before the United States would need to.
It's just all that free money goes right to meth.
Right to meth.
Right to meth.
That's
I would do meth too if I lived in an environment where there was only like 90 days of like light. I don't know what the real
I don't know about that. Yeah,
cycle is, but I know it gets quite depressing during.
I know their suicide rate is super high.
Yeah, because they're in their
vitamin D deficiencies.
Vitamin D deficiencies.
Anyway, that was a fun way to just point out the kind of the fucked up nature of this. And the point though is that I guess that I want to make in general is that, like, nobody cares about the people, on either of these sides. Like, the Ukrainians don't, like, the Ukrainian government doesn't give a shit about the people in Donbass. They just don't want to cede territory. And the Russians government doesn't give a shit about the people in Donbass. They just want to maintain influence over the region.
I think I agree with you. Like, these governments don't give a shit about the people there. I think the tragedy is that democracy, like, if you look at the election, their election in 2014, like, it was very, very slim margins. It was very clear. It's kind of like Civil War voting. You know what I mean? Like,
yep.
There was clearly a vote on ethnic lines. the problem is with a democracy, it's like majority rules. So effectively, one ethnic group rules over the other one under one government.
Right.
And when a country is divided like that already, then it creates for some serious problems when especially when the central government is grabbing up more and more power. So I think that's what's ultimately is the issue, is that, maybe there should be an Eastern Ukraine and a Western Ukraine. Like maybe they should just have a civil divorce where they can do what they want.
Maybe. But good luck getting anyone to agree to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, these governments don't give a fuck about these people at all. Right. They're just using them as pawns to, for their own, to enrich themselves. But that's my piece.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's wrap this one up then.
We will be launching this into a series where we go back and forth into the modern day geopolitical problems going on in Europe, along with the formation of these states in Eastern Europe over the past 1,000 years. So I hope you guys get excited for that. Kind of like our Japanese series that we just wrapped up. I think we learned a lot from that series, and I think this one will even be better. Do you have anything to say before we say our goodbyes? Talk about that video thing that you want to put on our Patreon.
Oh, yeah. So I discovered something cool, and I realized that when I do research for the show here, a lot of the times I have to I want to look at a map because I want to know how is it, geospatially. And the one thing that we're going to do right after the show here is test out a little video format where we kind of talk about a brief synopsis of what's going on currently, and we'll actually be looking at a map and drawing on a map live, and kind of showing where are all these places in the world for the people that don't know where they are, but also why they might be geospatially relevant, right? And by geospatially, I just mean where in the world they are and why they're relevant. That should be fun. We're going to do that right after here, and we'll post that on the Patreon. So if you guys want to support us, a really great way to do that would be to join our Patreon. There's all different levels of support that you can offer us, but we also offer new content that you don't get from the regular podcast. We did several episodes in the past couple of weeks that are extra, and this will be a little extra bonus. So look forward to that.
Yep, and you also get access to our Slack where we all talk and communicate, and it's a fun little community. All right, another way to support our show is to rate and review the podcast. If you're on an Apple device or if you listen to Apple Podcasts, just go in the top right-hand corner, click on the 5-star, write a review, say, hey, you guys are great, or hey, you guys suck, whatever you prefer. We prefer the you guys are great thing more than you guys suck. But yeah, leave us a rating and review, and then we will see you next week.
Peace.
Peace.